In this video tutorial, I'm going to explain how you go from a problem statement to your annotated bibliography to the research article. I've created a detailed outline to assist you with the genre of the research article. We will model ours after Victoria Marl's article, The Genres of Chi Omega. I will briefly demonstrate how to do a rhetorical genre reading of her work and how I use that info to create our outline. Thereafter, I'll provide some suggestions about how to reuse your annotated bibliography for the presentation and article. And last, I'll provide examples of how to write the individual sections of the article. When writing a research article in the social sciences and sciences, the research article functions like a collection of mini essays. Each section has its own mini intro, body, and conclusion. A reader should be able to start at any section, and for the most part, the sections should make sense because it'll have a main claim, body paragraphs, and conclusion. Let's start with a problem statement. I'm currently working on a research article about Tango literacy, a multimodal approach to writing, learning, and self-reflection. In higher education, we privilege what our brains can do for us and forget that our bodies play a significant role in learning. This is a problem because some learners are excluded from particular contexts in which one mode of learning is viewed as more valuable than another. Also, as a culture, we view embodied learning as less academic or intellectual, which justifies the lack of sufficient pay for certain embodied professions, for instance. To research my problem statement, I found over 50 articles on the topic. So I'm going to focus on just 4 of them to illustrate for you how the annotated bibliography can be used to help construct our article. As you can see, I have my citation, my summary paragraph, and my reflection analysis below. After I finished my annotated bibliography, I went through and reread them looking for patterns or themes. Below the document, I wrote keywords of those themes. What I'm trying to do is pair up sources, so pair up which experts are talking about the same thing. I look for similarities, and then I reread them again to find which ones offer a unique perspective or provide a contrastive point of view. So here are a few others that I did. In each instance, I'm trying to find those patterns. In some, we want to look for where these experts agree, where they expand on each other's work or contrast each other's work. So we're moving away from the kind of research that you're used to doing, possibly in high school, maybe even in other college classes, where it's all about just cherry-picking quotes. It's not about cherry-picking facts and dates and quotes. We're trying to figure out within our discourse communities, how are these experts talking about this problem? What kinds of points are they making? Where do they agree or disagree? So we're trying to recreate that conversation in order to jump into that conversation later with our own data set, with the genres we have selected. One advantage to writing keywords at the bottom of your annotated bibliography is that we can use those keywords to actually help us construct our topic sentences. So when we first set up the source, we will use those keywords or any one of those keywords. And then I just copy and paste that first summary into my article. Let's take a look at the article outline again to see how we can start our research article. We'll return to our annotated bibliography in a bit. At the very beginning of your article, the first thing you're going to do is write the introduction. So the introduction is where you introduce the problem by providing some background info or context. So this is where you might describe where this problem is taking place, who is impacted, when it happened, what changes have taken place to create the circumstances for the problem to exist. So for some of you, you might get this information from the very articles that you found. They all started with an introduction as well, where they did this very type of work. So you may summarize that information, of course, giving credit to the author. Some of you might use additional sources, so those outside your annotated bibliography, in order to contextualize this problem, to provide that bigger picture. The goal is for us to get to our specific problem statement. So the problem statement is what's connected to our actual genre set. Okay, so let's take a hypothetical situation. So for instance, let's say in the opening sentences of the article, someone may describe the pandemic and its impact on higher education and mental health. So that information may have come from the sources in your annotated bibliography, or maybe you did additional research using credible, reliable sources. Those sources must be cited, and they'll go in your Works Cited page, but they don't necessarily have to go into your annotated bibliography. So the specific problem that you would be looking at that's actually linked to the genre set might be, for instance, the problem of Zoom education for students struggling with social anxiety disorder. So we first need that bigger picture about the pandemic and higher education that would go into your introduction in order to talk about more specifically what's happening with Zoom education and students with social anxiety disorder, for instance. And maybe your question might be what accommodations are needed to address these student needs. Oftentimes, when writers make a problem statement, they often express how little research has been done in a particular concentrated area. So let's take an example from the actual Mara article. So in her article, she began with a statement about sororities existing for over 100 years. So she's providing us some background information. And then she segues into a discussion about genres and writing researchers and discourse communities. So she segues right away into that. But then she states, and this is her problem statement, not enough research has been done on the complex genre systems or genre sets used by sororities and fraternities. So that's the problem that she's trying to explore that needs further analysis. She needs to explain, well, why should we care about that? And she's going to explain that further down in the article. Once you introduce the actual problem, then you're going to summarize what your first expert says about that problem. And I state here you can select any one or two options below. So it's not a checklist, like you have to do each one of these, but you can select these as options to use in your paragraphs or paragraph. So you can talk about maybe with this first source, the actual source of the problem, the main causes for this problem. Maybe there are important definitions or terms that we need to know first before we can proceed with this discussion about this problem. We may want to learn about like the first researchers to study or discover this problem, or maybe we understand why it's a problem. Oftentimes, usually when a problem is introduced, we learn why it's a problem in the first place. And so then I'm going to go through my sources, and I want to find that first source that best provides that initial discussion, that introduction to the problem. And I go through and again looking at my keywords to kind of help me organize my sources. So once I pick my first source, I can just copy and paste that summary into the actual article, or if you're using this to help organize your presentation, you can use it for your presentation. Now you may want to trim some of the summary, so it's a detailed summary necessary for the annotated bibliography, but maybe you don't need as many details for the article itself. So then when I come to see what the next expert is going to say about this problem, oftentimes I want to do is find that person that also agrees with that first expert. So this is where they are complementing or sort of adding on to what that first expert said. Again, these are just suggestions, or maybe there's an alternative concept or theory that we need to know, or maybe we start to get more in depth into the various other reasons as to why it's a problem. So then we bring in that second expert. And so now when we start to bring in another source, again, we can go to our keywords here and use that as our topic sentences to help bridge these connections between these sources. Now, in bringing in that second source, oftentimes we're going to have to trim the actual paragraph because we'll find that we're just going to be repeating a lot of the same things because our sources oftentimes overlap quite a bit. So we don't need to say the same things over and over again. So what we want to do is find what is distinct about this particular second expert and how it complements and adds to the next one. And then we start to bring in the third expert or experts and what they had to say about this problem. And so this is where you imagine this roundtable discussion, everybody taking their turn and offering their own evidence, the results of their own study, or their alternative explanation or reason for why something is the way it is. And so again, it's 5 experts dealing with this particular problem. And discussing the same kinds of questions. And then towards the end of this section, you need to explain the implications of ignoring this problem and why that wouldn't be a good idea. Who would be impacted? So this is where we're starting to move towards the conclusion of this section. So all of the sections have their own beginning, middle, end. Introducing the problem, here's the evidence of the problem, and then this is why the problem matters. This is the so what factor, why people care about it. For that last paragraph in this section, we can copy what Maura did in her article. So when we go to research articles, especially when you're having to write your first one for publication, we often will copy what other published authors will do, especially in the social sciences and the sciences. We do not do this necessarily in the humanities. This would be flagged for plagiarism. But in the sciences, it's far more formulaic, and there is a particular genre, way of writing these articles, and almost always there's some transition where you will say, in this paper, I will look at the genres used within blank, whatever genres you're looking at within your discourse community, right? And so you can use her layout in this paragraph to help write your own paragraph to close off this section. So again, I return back and I created the template here, and that's how I created it. I just looked at hers and emulated it, and you can do the same, just sort of following this formula. If this formula is lacking information or context, just open up that Maura article that you can access in the schedule, and then look at her example and follow that structure. And then she doesn't have a theoretical framework, but many of these research articles do, so we're going to add that, and we're going to then basically reuse the summaries from your annotated bibliography that include the activity systems article as well as the genre theory one, the one I'm showing you now, the Maura article. And so you're going to use those two summaries, and you need transition sentences to connect the two paragraphs. All right, and so you will need to share also in that section a blank template of the activity systems triangle, and then you need a conclusion paragraph that will explain how you will use these theories to explore X, Y, and Z. So this is where you are restating that problem statement. You're going to use these theories to explore these issues in your discourse community and the genre set that you collected. All right, so then the next section is going to be the methodology section. And so again, I'm going to her article to use as a model. And I come here, and she starts with, I interviewed two sisters, including such and such. They were asked about certain technologies, about the genres within the sorority. And she talked about all the different interviews that she did. I'm coming back to my template. And one way to start it is to better understand, because I'm restating the problem here. So to better understand this problem, so briefly restating it, I interviewed, and then now you introduce your interviewee, and you establish that person's credentials. So if they run a clinic, or if they are a curator in a museum, I inquired about, so you give us a gist of the questions. Don't just tell us all 10 questions. You give us a gist, like the things that you asked about, and then you tell us where the interview was conducted, how it was conducted, and how long. So if it was done via email, you need to let us know that. If it was recorded over a phone conversation, it was 15 minutes, you would need to let us know that. So you want to be clear and detailed there. In the second paragraph, you're going to explain how you went about retrieving the genre set. So this is your data collection section of the article. Some of you have probably already written these types of research articles. So here's an example of what you can write. So this is for like my hypothetical research project. Facebook is the central venue where Tango organizers promote their events, festivals, and workshops. So I'm explaining to here why I picked Facebook. Efforts to change the culture of Tango will most likely begin with efforts made by Tango organizers. So I'm explaining here why I picked organizers. Okay, so if we're going to change the culture, we got to talk to the people at the top. In the last year, because people had not been dancing, the platform was used more readily to discuss various media topics like Black Lives Matter movement. After the March shootings at the Asian-owned massage salons, I searched my Facebook feed for conversations about the shooting. So this is why I picked the time that I did when I looked for conversations. I discovered one post that had 271 comments about whether the shooting was racially motivated. The high number of comments indicated that this was popular on the thread. So then I'm trying to convey here my assumptions, why I picked 271. That's high for my discourse community in my Facebook community. So it's not like Twitter that has millions of comments or thousands. And so I picked this number because it was high. Within the thread, I selected a contentious conversation between two prominent tango organizers. So I'm making it very clear that I purposely selected these two. There was a confrontation there. And then I indicated that I blacked out names to protect user privacy. And then I go and explain how I got the next genre set. Okay, so you can read this here closely to kind of see what I'm focusing in on. So to find further discussions about race and inclusion in tango, I searched my inbox for promotional emails and upcoming workshops on anti-racism and restorative justice in tango communities. I subscribed to a community lister created by founder and organizer Meredith Klein from Philadelphia Tango School. So I'm mentioning here her credentials, trying to establish her authority. It's also called ethos. And I mentioned that I subscribe, so it gives you a sense of like what I have access to. So you do have to subscribe. This is not available just to anybody. Since the pandemic, she has organized several workshops about social, cultural, racial problems. So that's why I picked her, not just any tango organizer. And then I would do for my last genre, right? So you can use that transition. You can copy that transition. And that's the thing about writing, again, articles like this, is that we tend to copy each other's phrases to help organize this complex research. And then you need a closing sentence, or it could be a closing paragraph. These three genres represent. So you're concluding a statement about what role these genres play within the community. In other words, we need some sense of how common, popular, important these genres are. So it's one thing to pick something that's really common, that really reflects the values of the community. But if you pick some really obscure genre that no one looks at, no one uses, yeah, it exists, but you can't really make any large claims about it because no one actually uses it. So then you need to kind of clarify for the audience the role that these genres play within that particular discourse community. All right, so then afterwards we have the findings section. This section may be a bit more challenging because now this is where we're going to do the analytical work. At the beginning of this section, you should write an opening sentence or paragraph that lets the reader know you're about to show us your completed activity systems graph. So after you add the graph, you need a paragraph that summarizes what it says. So for instance, at the beginning of my research article, I wanted to illustrate. So remind the reader the purpose of the activity system graph in 1 to 3 sentences. So oftentimes, because these different sections are standalone sections, we will repeat certain things, but very briefly, so that way we can use it to set up our actual results. Figure 1 below is an illustration of the, right? I guess technically it would be figure 2 because when we first add the blank graph, that's going to be figure 1. So I include the actual activity systems graph, and then I now talk about it. So within the Tango discourse community, the subjects would have, so as you recall, one of the points of the triangle has a subject section. So I'm just basically reading the triangle and I explain what I wrote. And then there's the tools part of the triangle and I explain what I wrote there. So you basically, and you can put in italics each of those corners and explain what you wrote. For the next few paragraphs, you now want to describe what the genres say and analyze the ways in which they reflect the values, goals, social structures, activities, roles, and beliefs of the community members. So in an activity theory or genre theory analysis, when we're talking about discourse communities, these are the buzzwords that are going to come up. And so here I have a list of things you could think about or talk about, but again, it's not a checklist. For each of you, it may be focusing more on the values, maybe focusing more on the goals, or maybe it's more about those social interactions, or maybe the activities that take place, or about individual roles or power structures, right? So you'll need to decide what the genres can teach us and decide on a particular focus. So we're only talking about a couple of paragraphs here. So you have at least 3 genres. So you might have at least 3 paragraphs here. Of course, you can combine genres if necessary, but we're looking at a couple of paragraphs here, anywhere from like 2 to 4 paragraphs, just analyzing these genres. The findings can be the most difficult to write, so make sure you want to organize it again as a mini essay with the beginning, middle, and end. And each paragraph should have one central point or idea that you're trying to convey. So, for example, if you're going to focus on the shared values of this discourse community, describe that in one paragraph. If you're going to elaborate on the ways the rules restrict certain activities or modes of communication, then describe that in another paragraph. Now, let's talk about the very last section. In this section, typically, researchers will talk about the findings and their significance to the larger discourse community. This is where you elaborate on that so what. Members of your discourse community would want to know why your findings matter and how they add to the existing literature. This is where your thesis is reinforced, your findings are reinforced. However, we're doing something slightly different for this article, doing something more reflective. For the purpose of this class article, I would like to hear what you have learned from doing this research. So at the very beginning of the semester, you had to write about something you were curious about in the past. For this project, you have to write about something you'll be curious about in the future, about a problem that you'll want to solve. So based on your library research and genre analysis, talk about in a few paragraphs what you learned and what further questions you have about this problem. In other words, be epistemically curious. And again, treat this section like a mini reflection essay now with its own beginning, middle, and end.